Good afternoon. Oops, the microphone works. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alicia Jones. I'm UAB's Chief Human Resources Officer. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today as we get the public results for our engagement survey. We want to go ahead and get started. Let's see here. I want to share with you that there's been a lot of work that's been done to get us to this point. And so, as you can see, we started work back in October 2016. You can see all the steps that were done to help us get there. Also, we had a steering committee that worked diligently to help make sure that we covered all the proper bases to make sure this survey was appropriate for all of our faculty and staff. You can see all the members listed on the steering committee. I also want to thank Susan Cohen, who's our Director of Organizational Learning and Development. Susan and her team worked so hard behind the scenes to make sure that everything was done and everything was done properly. We wouldn't be in this place without Susan and her team, so I want to publicly thank them for their hard work. All right, well, it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Watts, and he is going to come and give us greetings, and then we'll hear from our new Senior Vice President and Provost, Dr. Pam Benoit as well, and then we'll get into the results. Thank you.
Let me add my welcome and thank you all for being here, and thank our campus community for participating in this important survey. We have now seen the preliminary results, which we'll share today, and we found many positive attributes. Great sense of pride in working at UAB, supporting our mission, great sense of pride in our national and international stature, and really recognizing how important UAB is not just to Birmingham, but to Alabama and to the United States of America and people around the world. As you know, we have a large population of international faculty, students, postdoctoral fellows, and we want to be an inviting campus that welcomes everyone and treats everyone equally well and with respect. And we want to build on those attributes, but we also want to determine the things that we can do better. Now, remember early in this process, I had some faculty and others ask, well, if we go through this survey, are we really going to do anything differently based on what we find? And I said, absolutely yes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be going through the trouble, the effort, the expense, etc. And we know that there are a number of surveys. I know in the School of Medicine and the health system, there was a survey that has been ongoing for many years that was only a month or two before this survey, which was meant to be across the campus. And we had many good findings, and I know you'll enjoy hearing these today, and then hearing next steps, because I can tell you we've already put things in place based on some of the clear feedback that we've received. And we want to communicate as much and as well as possible all the great things going on at UAB with all of our employees, our faculty, our staff, our students, our alumni, and our community. So thank you for being here. I think you'll find these results interesting, and there are clearly actionable items that we will work on throughout the coming year, and we will drill down to the schools and the individual units so they will have the opportunity for feedback too. Thanks for being here. And I'm very pleased to introduce our new Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Pam Benoit. Pam?
Thank you. I want to start by saying that it's very exciting to be here in Birmingham and at UAB, and to begin my work as Senior Vice President and Provost as you continue with both your comprehensive strategic planning process and with this very important engagement survey process. One of the things that I would like to share is that I also had experience with the same sort of engagement process at my previous institution. And one of the things that happened there is that there was really significant change in the way we approach things at that institution, and I'm sure that that will happen here as well. I'm very committed to working with you and with the deans to better understand and to address the issues that we're going to hear about today. One of the things that I saw as I looked through the survey results, and I know we'll talk about more today, is the institutional pride in this institution. And I have to tell you that that's one of the things that attracted me to come here. And it's a real strength at this institution. But we'll also be reviewing communication structures, processes, ways to be better as an institution, and look forward to ways that we can always improve. And so let's get to the results. Let's find out about how we can together be an even better institution going forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, to help us with this survey, we partnered with Modern Think. And Modern Think is one of, clearly a leader in this area. So we were really glad to have them as a partner. And even more so than Modern Think, the consultant that we've had to work with us has been exceptional. Rich has guided us through all of the steps of this, helping us understand next steps and should we best approach it. So to present our results to you, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Boyer.
I'm thrilled to be here. This is an important milestone in an important project that you all have been undertaking for quite some time now. I know in Alicia's slide, she mentioned kind of a start date in terms of engagement with Modern Think of 2016. And the reality is Susan Cohen and her team have been talking with my colleagues at Modern Think for probably almost 2 years, I think, before that, trying to lay the groundwork for what we're doing here today. One of the things that is important in terms of this type of work is to make sure you've got appropriate support from the senior leadership. And I know Susan Cohen spent a lot of time getting that support, assembling this steering committee and engaging the cabinet and the Dean's Council and understanding the importance of this work. So it's a thrilling milestone here to be here with you all today to share these results. I know many folks probably aren't familiar with Modern Think. I assume most folks are familiar with the Chronicle of Higher Education, but just by way of context, but just by a show of hands if I can, how many folks are familiar with the Chronicle's program, The Great Colleges to Work For? Okay, so not quite everybody. So I just want to share very briefly because that informs some of what informs our analysis, frankly. So we're now in the 10th year of the Great Colleges to Work For program. We're the research partner for the Chronicle in this. To date, we've had over 1,000 unique colleges and universities participate in the program. I share that with you because the survey instrument that we used here for UAB survey was based on that instrument. It's an instrument that we've refined over the years and continue to refine to make sure it does resonate with the higher education audience and gets to the core issues. So without further ado, let me share some of what we found in this year's results. I think one of the things, and again, I think Dr. Watts alluded to this is a high-level findings presentation. This is a tremendously robust data set. You'll get a sense of that as we talk about the instrument itself. And our intention today is to share some of the key findings and key themes, and as Alicia will speak to here at the end in terms of next steps, you'll see that we'll now kind of entering the next phase of the project where we'll be looking to disseminate the results at kind of organizational and unit level. So today we'll stay largely at the kind of institution-wide level. So just by way of quick background, the survey instrument included 60 what we call core belief statements. These are belief statements that we use in the Great Colleges to Work For program. So it gives us tremendous benchmarking capabilities, as you might imagine. The steering committee added 5 additional statements specific to dynamics and issues that we knew were relevant here at UAB. There was a benefit satisfaction component. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but notably, there were 14 demographic questions. 9 which were voluntary, 5 of which we preloaded the data. So with those 14 demographic questions, it gives us tremendous ability to disaggregate the data set by meaningful groups so we can be more targeted in our analysis and in our next steps. The survey itself was administered April 12th through 16th, and our first data point we'll talk about here is the response rate. Now, given the fact that you all do not have a long or successful history doing surveys like this, certainly you've done a number of other surveys, whether it be Coach surveys or Harry surveys or Nessie surveys, the reality is we've not had a long history of doing engagement/culture surveys on a regular basis. And to the extent that we do, for many, the memory of that work wasn't necessarily as positive as we might want. So from the very beginning of this project, Susan, her team, the steering committee, have been very intentional about the process so that we could give folks as positive an experience as possible with this instrument so we could rebuild some of that trust in the process as well model the leadership and the institution's commitment to being good stewards of the culture. Given that we don't have that history of a long and regular surveys like this, a 44% response rate is very solid, given, again, that lack of history. By way of context, in the Great Colleges to Work For program, where, again, every year we're surveying typically between 260 and 320 institutions across the country, we generally see response rates between 36 and 46%. When we're working with institutions outside of the context of that program and can be more thoughtful about a company communication strategy and potentially incentives, it's not uncommon for us to see response rate at the 60, 70, in some cases even 80% level. So we've got a solid response rate to begin with. The next administration of the survey, I hope we'll build on that, and I expect we will, given some of the early feedback that we've had. I often talk about surveys as being an assessment, right? It's a diagnostic tool. And I think at the same time, surveys are a communication tool. It's an opportunity to solicit input from our faculty, from our staff, from our community, and importantly, to play it back, right? If we just solicit input and don't do anything with it, in many cases, it can do more harm than good. So an important part of the process is sharing the survey results. We're at the initial stages of that now. This is a first opportunity to do a high-level findings presentation to a public forum. Over the last month and a half, I've had similar presentations, largely the same presentation with the cabinet, the dean's council, leadership of the faculty senate, leadership from staff council, as well as the steering committee itself. So we're in the early stages of sharing the results. In terms of contextual information, we've got a couple benchmarks given our capabilities at Modern Think and in partnership with the Great Colleges to Work For program. So the two benchmarks that I'll talk about here, and you'll see some data that we can compare UAB against. One is one we call the honor roll. And for those who are not familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program, there are 12 different recognition categories. Any participating institution could be recognized in any one of those. Institutions that are ranked in the most number of categories achieve this special designation that we call the honor roll. Essentially, it's not a bright line distinction. For all practical purposes, you need to be recognized in 6 recognition categories or more. It's our attempt to find essentially what we would characterize as an aspirational benchmark. Right? We're the best of the best workplaces in higher ed today. So that's the honor roll benchmark. The steering committee back months ago also provided us with a list of your own aspirational peers. We cross-referenced that with our benchmark, had, I believe, 6 institutions in our database, put their data together in aggregate and created a special UAB aspirational peer benchmark. So in addition to seeing how you compare today against the best of the best that we can find, we also have a chance to compare and see how we stand up against your peers. Breaking down our response rate, I mentioned that our overall response rate was at 44%. Very solid across the board. Here we're breaking it down by our major job classifications. You will note there are a couple kind of outliers, if you will. That's not surprising when we look at some of those areas. And one of the things that we'll want to do in terms of learning from this administration of the survey is figure out how we can reach out to some of these groups that we didn't get quite as high a response rate as we would like in the future survey process. We'll talk more specifically about that, and I'm happy to field questions about that. One of the things that these response rates tell us, one, we got a good baseline, and importantly, when we look at the confidence levels and margins of error, particularly at the data set as a whole, we can operate with a high degree of confidence that this data is in fact reflective of the population as a whole, even without response rates at the 60, 70, 80%. Obviously, we have to look at those confidence intervals independently when we look at the unit level, but overall, we've got a very solid data set. I'm going to go back for 1 second on this. One of the bullet points I didn't speak to on that first section, survey instrument, you'll note that we asked 3 open-ended questions. The verbatim responses were fascinating, informative. I shared with the cabinet, the steering committee, the dean's council, that faculty and staff are a lot of things at UAB, but disengaged is not one of them. Those 3 open-ended questions resulted in almost 600 pages of verbatim responses. of which I will share a couple with you today that I think are reflective of what I would characterize as pervasive themes in those comments. Okay. Let's talk very briefly, the survey instrument itself, and I'm happy to field questions offline. Given our time right now, this isn't the best forum to go into the specifics of the instrument. There are 15 major dimensions or factors. When we do the factor analysis, these are the ones that shake out. We take a little poetic license in how we characterize them just to make them more user-friendly for folks who aren't doing survey research every day. One of the things, for those who are familiar with the construct of employee engagement, you'll note a lot of the things that are typically associated with employee engagement you'll see here. The experience of immediate supervisor, the experience of senior leadership. There are also some factors here that you're not going to see in most of the engagement research. So for example, in higher ed, we have this thing called shared governance, right, which we don't see in a lot of industries and sectors. We know it's an important part of a healthy culture in higher ed, so we actually we're very intentional about asking questions about that. The next two slides are, I would say arguably, but I don't even think arguably, the most important slides here. So I want to share with you some of the high-level themes, some of the key findings that we've found here. And some of these, I think, reflect some of the comments that you've already heard from Dr. Watts, from Dr. Benoit, and from Alicia. So there is a tremendous sense of connection to and pride in the mission of UAB. Particular points of pride include the impact and reputation of the Birmingham community, UAB's progress and rising national reputation, and the commitment to being innovative and distinctive. There were comments over and over again in those 600 pages that I alluded to that spoke to these dynamics. And if we go to that second bullet point, that sense of pride, and I think it is building on the sense of pride, partially informed by that sense of pride, is the sense of optimism that accompanies UAB's growth and its rising national reputation. Folks have tremendous pride for the impact you all are having, not just with your students, but with the community here in Birmingham, what you're doing to elevate the status of Alabama, the role you play in Alabama as an employer, and the impact you're having nationally and even internationally. I have to tell you, I was at the Residence Inn this morning. I was doing some work over breakfast, and I heard a number of folks talking about their association with UAB. And in the span of about 15 minutes, I heard Mandarin, Spanish, English, and 2 other languages that I couldn't identify. Right? So when we talk about international impact and the role that you're having, I think it shows up in a lot of different ways. That sense of pride, that connection to mission, and I will share you within higher ed, as well as in the healthcare industry, we often see kind of higher scores as it relates to the impact of our work, but that's not something to take granted or lightly. Faculty and staff very much appreciate the ability to make a difference in the lives of students and patients in the community of Birmingham and the state of Alabama. And there is a tremendous sense of appreciation for the commitment to being a diverse and inclusive community. Now, I choose my words carefully there. There's appreciation for the commitment to being a diverse and inclusive community. And, for some, we're not where we would want to be in terms of that welcoming environment or the sense of respect or the sense of fair treatment. So there's work to be done, no doubt. And there's, again, a tremendous sense of appreciation for the institutional commitment towards that end. Job fit, job satisfaction, important drivers of an engaged workforce. Are people in the roles that serve them well, that speak to their skills, their capabilities, that provide a sense of meaning. When we look at the statements related to that, we see very strong responses, not just about job fit, but also about flexibility and autonomy. And autonomy for faculty, often that shows up in the kind of the experience of academic freedom. And while academic freedom may not resonate as much for those who aren't in faculty roles, nonetheless, staff here across many different job classifications, again, report strong findings as it relates to the antithesis, if you will, of being micromanaged, right? They have the flexibility, the autonomy, the support they need to be effective in their roles. Perhaps not as glamorous, but important, the support for benefits and work-life balance, and the stability of UAB. And those were particularly resonant among staff. A great sense of appreciation for the stability of this institution as an employer, the appreciation for the benefits, and again, the support for work-life balance. Relationships, that's another theme that surfaces in these comments. A tremendous sense of appreciation for the relationships that folks have here. For staff and faculty, they report having good relationships with their supervisors. Now, having said that, I suspect many of us, if not all of us in this room, know that simply having a good relationship with a supervisor doesn't necessarily mean they're an effective manager, an effective supervisor, effective leader. It's a good foundation on which to build, though. So we want to take advantage of that. In the same breath that folks report having good relationship, they also report a need for greater consistency and enhanced managerial leadership skills, specifically those regarding communication, performance management, and accountability. Right? And I'll give you some greater sense of insight into that momentarily. That sense of community, the sense of camaraderie, the sense of collegiality doesn't just play out between one immediate supervisor and an individual, though. We also see many folks reporting a strong sense of appreciation for the quality of the relationships they have with their colleagues, the sense of community, the sense of camaraderie, particularly at the work group or local level. I want to share with you just very briefly two of the verbatim responses, the comments to those open questions that I think speak to a couple of the dynamics we're talking about here. One is the sense of optimism. And I have to tell you, I was a little surprised by this. And while I mentioned that you all have been very methodical in this survey administration, we haven't gone through all the details. But one of the things that we did, even before we surveyed faculty and staff, was we did essentially a listening campaign. Right? We did a series of focus groups. I suspect some of you participated in there. And in those focus groups, we asked thoughts around what ideas they had around topical areas we might include in the survey other than the ones that we have in our core survey. We asked people to give us their thoughts around what would it make for a successful survey. We asked for them to share with us the concerns that they had. And based on the focus group findings, I was not sure what we were going to find in the survey itself as it related to a sense of optimism. And I was pleasantly surprised and inspired to see that sense of optimism that I've alluded to. This is not an isolated comment here. This individual writes, "While there have been issues in the past, I do believe we are on the right track with open communication and the culture we are trying to build. We still have a long way to go, but it is nice to see how far we have come on campus." And again, that was what I would characterize as a pervasive theme in those comments. Okay, let's look at a second slide of kind of some overarching themes here. And I suspect this is not going to be news to anybody in this room, but one of the major themes that showed up in terms of pain points was this theme of resource constraints. And it shows up in a number of different ways. It shows up regarding compensation. It shows up regarding staffing. It shows up regarding facilities and parking. And I will tell you that I get to see a lot of colleges and universities' data sets and go to a lot of colleges and universities today. And I can probably count on one hand the colleges I've visited where parking isn't a problem, right? Particularly at urban universities. And having said that, it is acute. The frustration, the concerns, for many faculty and staff here, it's acute here. Now, in terms of when I'm doing my analysis on a data set like this, I like to have a sense of the bigger picture. So I'll often look at where the institution is in their accreditation cycle, where they are in the status of their strategic plan, what's happening in terms of their master plan. And one of the things in our discovery process that's kind of surfaced for me, I think we'll talk about strategic applications, and I think even Dr. Watts alluded to this. There's a lot of potential applications for the survey data. And the fact that you're in a strategic planning process, of which some of that work is revisiting institutional values. This data set has great potential to support that. In fact, I didn't mention this, but I actually, when I was here a month ago, met with the Strategic Planning Committee to share some of the potential connections between this survey data and the work that they were doing. And I might note that because when I look at what I saw in terms of the master plan, it looks like there are a lot of good things that you all have, a lot of aspirations, a lot of potential. I'm not sure everybody knows about some of those good things. I think that also informs some of the frustration on those. We're going to talk about a culture of communication here when we look at a couple of statements individually. And one of the things that we see here is that faculty and staff both are eager for more communication from and with senior leadership, particularly as it relates to vision. And that gives us kind of a nice segue into the second bullet point here, as well as a greater sense of alignment across senior leadership. So today, I would suggest that there's probably not a high percentage of folks who either see the cabinet or the dean's council themselves as high-performing teams individually or even collectively as an aligned sense of senior leadership, right? And I shared that very directly with your cabinet and with your dean's council, and I think nobody waved me off, said that wasn't the case, right? I think there's an acknowledgement that there's an opportunity to create a greater sense of alignment among leadership here. And related to that, obviously, it's a dynamic of communication from and with senior leadership. That's important work. And the opportunities that are present here as related to creating a greater sense of culture of communication extend beyond just communication with senior leadership. right? So there's absolutely work to be done there. And the question I'd ask rhetorically, particularly those who are attending here, either virtually or in person, is what can you do individually to create that greater sense of communication? We'll inform that comment with some data here momentarily. The communication, two of the themes, and this relates to the third bullet, when we're looking at the best workplaces that we can find, a couple of things stand out in terms of their communication practices. One, there's a real commitment to being appropriately transparent. And I think the qualifier there is important. We don't want to manage expectations appropriately. Just because we have a commitment to transparency doesn't mean everybody gets everything. There may be certain business decisions, strategic decisions, financial decisions, HR decisions that necessarily need to be held in a smaller circle. Right? That's good business, and in many cases it would be illegal to do otherwise. But on the whole, is the institution appropriately transparent? So that's one differentiating quality of communication at great workplaces. The other, and related to that, is a real commitment to being interactive, to being participatory, right? That faculty and staff don't just feel talked to, but they feel talked with. And one of the things I think your steering committee and your leadership has done really well in the administration of this survey is modeled that. When we initially assembled the steering committee, we got some feedback that we needed better representation, particularly from faculty senate and staff council. And guess what? We opened that up and brought more folks on. Right? So I think some of the things that were known issues to not just leadership here, not just to members of the steering committee, but again to many of you all sitting here as a function of your experience at this institution, we tried in this process to model the kinds of behaviors that we aspire to be. And on the whole, from an objective external perspective, I think you all have done some very good work towards that end. We've talked about strong relationships and the sense of community. There is a tremendous sense of community within many departments. Now, what's interesting here is the strength of that community and camaraderie today isn't necessarily translating to what we would characterize as strong levels of cross-functional collaboration or a sense of alignment across the university. Right? And in those 600 pages of verbatim responses, there were a number of comments that spoke to kind of the silo mentality that we have, whether it be the mentality of individuals or that the structure that we have encourages that kind of thinking. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of next steps. Concerns regarding accountability, especially as it relates to the inability to deal with low performers, disrespectful behaviors, and the perception of favoritism. Right? Let me share one other comment with you related to that, because this, again, was a pretty significant theme in the verbatim responses. We have some truly exceptional faculty and staff and administrators. We also have some mediocre or purposely obstructive individuals who are not team players, who do not embody UAB's core values, and yet who are allowed to continue holding us back from achieving institutional goals. UAB is not great at coaching people up, and it's even worse at removing toxic players. Until we quit working around people, we are never going to be able to reach our full potential as an institution. And again, not an isolated comment. Our inability to deal with those who aren't necessarily modeling the behaviors or performing to the standards that we want. I mentioned that Great Colleges to Work For program earlier. The results are published in a special supplement that the Chronicle produces every year. It's called The Academic Workplace. I don't know if folks saw this either online or the hard copy. It just came out last Monday. And the title, which I think is not only appropriate for what we're seeing, but also appropriate for what's happening here at UAB, is Breaking Down Barriers. And if you've not had a chance to look at this, there's some really interesting articles to see around what institutions are doing, trying to create that greater sense of collaboration, greater sense of alignment, and greater sense of being all in it together. Okay, one of the things that differentiates great workplaces is the consistency of the experience across the organization. The best workplaces don't tend to be just great workplaces for those who are sitting around the cabinet table, right? Or those who are in a particular college or unit. There's a consistency of experience. So one of the things that we look at, and we're, again, high levels here, looking at it across our major job classification groups here. And notwithstanding the lower response in our skilled crafts and technical paraprofessional, that's not a huge range in terms of the high to low on this. So this actually is a nice finding, particularly in an early survey like this, a baseline, if you will, moving forward. Similarly, one of the things that we heard in the focus groups was one that people were concerned about the confidentiality of their individual survey results, right? Who's going to have access to this? So we went to great efforts in our communication prior to the survey to let folks know that, we were going to protect your individual anonymity. We weren't going to be reporting data out by any demographic subset if we had less than 5 respondents, and we weren't going to do crosstabs where in a way that such people would be able to identify and say, okay, there's a Hispanic male 45 to 55 in the Department of English, that's got to be XYZ, right? So we're not going to do that. And there were also concerns around not just the individual anonymity, but around the transparency with which the results would be shared, right? You know, you're not going to share them at either the low scoring statements, or you're not going to share the unit level. And in the spirit of transparency, we want to share with you, again, what we see at the college, school, and at the major unit level. So what we're looking at is the overall positive response across the 60 core statements. And for those who may not remember, these belief statements, we ask people to respond to on a 5-point agreement scale. Strongly agree, and agree being the most favorable. There is a not applicable, but it's infrequently selected, and we'll provide a bunch of response distribution reports so you can see the exact breakdown for each statement by different demographics. But for our purposes here today, this is essentially a version of top box analysis. We're looking at the 2 most favorable responses, strongly agree, and characterizing that as a positive response. So this is the positive response across the 60 core statements by college or school. You'll see a little bit more variation here than we saw across the job classification, right? So this enables us to see, you know, what colleges, what schools are doing really well, which ones potentially need a little more support. Similarly, we can do this at the unit level. You know, one of the things we're not going into great detail here is in terms of the number of respondents in the ends. I was teasing Dr. Watts when we first looked at this that he has a relatively small N in the office of the president, so that he couldn't get too carried away with being at the top of the list there. Now, having said that, that doesn't minimize the good work of any of these departments or colleges or units that are doing good work, regardless of the ends themselves. Okay. So again, it gives us insight to where there are pockets of excellence, where there's some internal best practices we can learn from, and where there are some areas we need to focus. Now, on this note, you know, one of the things that I shared with both the cabinet as well as the Dean's Council, and as you might imagine, you know, if you're a dean of one of these institutions or a vice president own one of these unit levels, you're going to have great interest in what's happening in your specific area. And that's actually part of the next steps. I'll be coming back next month. We'll be disseminating unit level and college level data to the deans and the vice presidents. And the expectation is by a certain point in time, they're going to be sharing that with their individual units. Now, that's important work. Now, one of the messages I also shared in the spirit of creating a greater sense of alignment, you know, the senior leaders of this institution collectively need to own this data as a whole. Right? If I'm a dean, I don't get just to focus on my area. Certainly there's important work there, but that's not where my responsibility stops. If we want to create a greater sense of alignment across this institution, we need to create a greater sense of alignment and partnership across all different levels of leadership, at the cabinet, at the Dean's Council, and at the levels below. Okay, barometer statements. For us, we define a barometer statement as something where there may not be necessarily anything actionable in it, but gives us insight into something we know is really important. Statement 25, overall, my department is a good place to work. What we're looking at here in terms of numerics are the positive response, and then we've also included the negative response, the combined strongly disagree and disagree. Here we've got our 2 external benchmarks. So in my experience, great workplaces start at the local level. I have yet to see a whole lot of organizations where people are miserable in their team or their department or their unit, but they somehow experience the organization as a great workplace, right? So looking at what's happening at the granular level is important, and we've got a terrific finding there. When we expand the frame of reference, statement 60, all things considered, this is a great place to work. At 75 and 4, still very, very solid. When you have a positive response at the 75% level or above, we would characterize that as, you know, exceptional. It may not necessarily be at the elite levels of the honor roll, but that's the realm, quote unquote, of great workplaces. Let me skip 59. I want to come back to that. Statement 36, this sense of pride. We talked about that when we looked at the thematic analysis in terms of some of those bullet points. And, you know, this finding here, I'm proud to be part of this institution at 84 and 2, 4 points off the honor roll. You know, when you're within 5 points of the benchmark, the honor roll benchmark, we would characterize that as within striking distance. It's an exceptional finding. Okay, this institution's culture, statement 59, this is also an interesting statement. This statement at our honor roll institutions is highly predictive of statement 60, all things to consider, this is a great place to work. One of the things that we're learning is that the perception of a special and unique culture tends to be a differentiating quality of great workplaces. I've seen that dynamic in other industries as well. It's pretty consistent, actually. And for me, I think there is tremendous opportunity for you all here on this. How is it we better tell the story of who we are as an institution, what's special and unique about our culture, and the impact we're having on our students, our patients, this town, this state, this nation, right? How can we collectively better tell that so there's a greater appreciation for this special and unique culture that is playing out at UAB? And I will tell you, I get to, again, I see a lot of colleges and universities. There's no doubt in my mind that you all do have a special and unique culture. And I've already had some interesting conversations with your chief communications officer around how is it we use this story to use this data to help better tell that story. Okay. Strengths, again, building on some of those key themes we talked about. If I had to identify kind of 5 topical areas: job satisfaction, connection to mission, and pride, supervisors, department chairs. I don't want to sound like I'm sending a mixed message. There's good news there, and that doesn't mean we wouldn't be well served by upping the quality, consistency, and caliber of those who are in supervisory, managerial, and leadership positions. Tremendous appreciation for the professional development opportunities here, as well as the work-life balance and benefits we've talked about, and the commitment to diversity and inclusion. You'll get a sense of some of these. This is my quick homage to David Letterman, top 10 statements, right? What are the 10 statements where we scored the best on? So if we look at that, you'll see, again, some echoing some of the themes that we've already talked about. Statement 5 is about job fit and connection to mission. Statement 49, obviously that sense of impact in the community. Exceptional findings on both of those. We talked about statement 36. Statement 2 is that statement around autonomy, right? I'm given the responsibility and freedom to do my job within 4 points of the benchmark. Notably, that again was strong across all job classifications, and a really nice finding on that. We talked a little bit about supervisor relationship. It's a great place to start, but doesn't necessarily mean our work is done. Second half of our top 10 statements, statement 50 gives us insight into the institutional commitment. This institution places sufficient emphasis on having diverse faculty, administration, and staff. So the commitment is there, even though we may not necessarily have achieved where we ultimately want to be. Statement 29, it's not a glamorous question, but it's an important statement from a safety perspective, particularly in an urban environment. Very solid finding on that. 1 is about job fit, 25 we've talked about, 47 again is support for work-life balance, rather than coming at it from an institutional kind of policy process lens. This is coming at it from the support one gets from their immediate supervisor. Very solid finding on that. Okay, so we've talked about some strengths. In the spirit of fairness and transparency, we had to talk about some opportunities. So where are those opportunities? So we talked about resource constraints. We've talked about performance management, senior leadership. To me, communication, collaboration, and shared governance go hand in hand. I think in many regards, there's almost a hierarchy there. Right? I think I've yet to see a high-performing team that collaborates really well that doesn't communicate well. Right? So if we want high degrees of collaboration, we need to make sure our communication is sound. And then in higher ed, obviously, we've got this very unique form of collaboration that we call shared governance. Another piece that tends to differentiate workplaces is a culture of respect and appreciation. That's also considered a driver in most of the academic research on employee engagement, and we see there's some opportunity there. All right, so let's look at our bottom 10. So I talked about resource constraints. You'll note a couple of things, you keen observers out there. So we've got much lower positive response, much higher negative response. You'll note on some of these statements that are honor roll institutions that those numbers are significantly lower than we've talked about as before. I'll put some context there as well. 28 about adequate staffing. This has been an issue for colleges and universities across the country really since 2008. We're still finding our way out of the recession, getting accustomed to the new normal, trying to deal with shrinking budgets, shrinking endowments. So you're not alone in that. When you see a negative response at the 20% level above, that's what we would characterize as acute. We really need to be paying attention there. I got a letter from the Chronicle today. They sent me a letter that was a letter to the editor that was a very well thought letter. Some might characterize it as a treatise from a faculty member at an institution that was honored on the honor roll. And this faculty member, that didn't resonate with their personal experience. So they were writing to the Chronicle to let them know, we think you missed the boat on this one, right? This is not actually a great place to work. And what I've shared with the folks at the Chronicle, what I've shared with other colleagues of yours here today, even at the best workplaces we can find in higher ed, there's still a small percentage of the community that's committed to being miserable, right? Even at the very best workplaces. So negative response in and of itself isn't an issue. But negative response at the 20% level or higher, we need to be paying attention to. 22 changes that affect me are discussed prior to being implemented. This is related to senior leadership communication, but not isolated there. One of the dynamics that surfaces in the verbatim responses is that many folks, faculty and staff, feel that, well, certainly some members of the cabinet are doing a good job communicating. that is the consistency, that the messaging isn't cascading down and throughout the organization or cascading up, right? So I think there's opportunities in terms of a culture of communication, again, extend beyond just Dr. Watts or Dr. Benoit being open and transparent and being available. Sense that we're all on the same team at this institution, 58. Big gap there with the honor roll institution. At honor roll institutions, this statement also correlates very closely with both 59 and 60, the perception of a special and unique culture and the sense that it's a great place to work. So, I think at any four-year large public institution, particularly one as complex as you all are in terms of how you're organized and structured, this becomes more challenging, but it is not impossible. I think there's great value, great opportunity, and you all telling your story better about what makes your culture special and unique so that it does create a greater sense that we're all in it together. Meaningfully involved in institutional planning. You can see, again, big gap there with our honor roll and paid fairly for my work. All right, let's look at our second half. Senior leadership communicates openly about important matters. Statement 18, issues of low performance are addressed in my department. You got a sense of that in the comment that I shared with you earlier here at the outset. Again, characterized as a pretty pervasive theme. 43 is about the quality of dialogue, right? It has nothing to do with senior leadership communication per se, but do we discuss and debate issues respectfully to get better results, right? So again, I've shared these results with your cabinet, with your dean's council. I think there was no real data denial regarding the need for leaders to communicate better. And this dynamic here at 43 is something that's, everybody who's attending, who's watching, who's here, this is in your sphere of control, right? This is something you have ability to influence. How is it we're contributing and creating and cultivating a culture of communication where we can discuss and debate issues to get the best result, right? Without taking it personally. We did some recent work and actually presenting it. There's a association, Network for Change and Continuous Innovation in Higher Ed. It was an offshoot of NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. We did some research with them over the last 12 months where we looked at 12 of these statements here to see if we could make any connection to some of the academic research on the conditions necessary for a culture of innovation or creativity. There were 6 statements that when we did the factor analysis, were highly correlated. This is one of those. So if we have a value of innovation, if we say that we aspire to be innovative, that this is who we are, then this is a statement that we would want to excel at, right? Okay, regular and open communication among faculty, administration, and staff. Again, similar to some of the other dynamics that we've talked about. 16 is about performance management as well. One of the other statements around performance management is we saw the issues of low performance. We see this statement as it relates to promotions being fair. We also saw some concerns regarding onboarding and orientation processes. And I think, again, as Dr. Watts alluded to, many of the issues that surfaced in the survey weren't unknown issues, and there's work being done on them as it relates to performance management, professional development, and even the onboarding process. All right, so some high-level recommendations. Again, recognizing we're at the proverbial 60,000-foot level. I mentioned earlier surveys are a communication tool in addition to being an assessment tool. It's good practice to play the results back. So we're at the kind of the next stages. We've shared it with the leadership teams of faculty senate, staff council, dean's council, strategic planning committee, steering committee, in the cabinet. Now we're taking it out to the public forums, and this is, again, something we'll continue. For those who aren't on campus now, we'll do a replay of this, if you will, in the fall when we're more together as a full community. One of the things I alluded to earlier is the strategic connections and the strategic applications of this kind of data. So certainly strategic planning process is one. While I recognize the institution as a whole is 5 years into your accreditation cycle and got some good news there, many of the colleges who are in various stages of their own accreditation cycles. And there's a tremendous overlap, and it's not accidental, between the kinds of statements we ask here and many of the standards that most of the accreditors are looking for. Diversity initiatives, and marketing and branding efforts. A lot of potential application for this, so we want to make sure that we use these so that rather than being one-off initiatives that folks see or may not know about, that there's a sense of alignment around how all this work connects. So the third, there is no question that this institution is going to be well served by faculty, staff having a greater sense of connection to and confidence in senior leadership. Right? We've talked about that in terms of senior leadership communication. We've talked about that in terms of alignment. And it's not just in alignment of the cabinet or the dean's council, but alignment among the multiple levels of leadership at the institution. When there's a greater sense of alignment there, typically that helps create a greater sense of confidence in not just the senior leadership teams themselves, but also in the shared governance model. So communication, I think that's, communication and shared governance, they're easy to talk about the abstract, they're difficult to do well, right? There's no one right shared governance model. I've seen many, many, many shared governance models that look very different, that all can be very effective. Similarly, having a culture of communication is more complex than it sounds often. So I think one of the things that will probably serve you well for you to take a closer look at what it is we're doing today: structure, processes, norms, expectations, what's working, what do we want to continue, what's not working, what are we not doing that we should be doing. There's a lot of lessons that I suspect we can learn from some of those internal pockets of excellence, as well as some of what we're surfacing in this Great Colleges to Work For program. Regarding the performance management, again, as I alluded to, known issue, right? Nobody was surprised by any of this. There's work being done on that already. So part of it is about the performance management process itself. Related to that is the consistency of that. And let me tie this a couple threads together. Earlier I talked about the need for greater sense of competence and consistency at the supervisory level, regardless of what level of the organization it is. If we have managers, supervisors, leaders who aren't comfortable with some of what are typically difficult conversations, right? Telling somebody their work isn't up to par, they're not going to get the promotion, we're not going to have the resources that we want. Those are all difficult conversations. And if we're not skilled and confident in those conversations, one of two things typically happens. As a manager who's not skilled and comfortable in those, I avoid the conversation, right? Or I have the conversation and it doesn't go as well as it should. So we think for you all that there's great opportunity in ensuring that those who are in these important roles are comfortable with these difficult conversations. Okay, and that speaks to the bullet point 6 here, and related to the special and unique culture. I think a tremendous unleveraged opportunity, if you will. There's no doubt in my mind you all are doing some tremendous things here, right? They're doing differently and in many cases better than what we would see at large comparable universities with major health science centers. You've got a tremendous story to tell to the world and to you all, to yourselves here. So we think there's a great opportunity for you to be more intentional on focusing and articulating, quote unquote, the unique value proposition or employment brand that is UAB. I think that'll create a greater sense of not just pride, but a greater sense of alignment and that experience of shared culture. All right, so this is not intended to be, all down to the granular detail, high-level findings. And with that, please know that Alicia's going to speak to next steps here, and we'll carve out some time for questions. This is an important day. It's an important milestone in the project. You all have done some excellent work to this point, and hopefully I'm going to help hold you all and yourselves accountable to continuing the work at the high level you already are. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Rich, again, for all of your help, all of your support throughout the process, and as well as providing that overview. There is so much information. I know it was hard to get it all compacted into this presentation, but again, as Rich said, the information will be broken down and shared at the college, school, and unit level. So let me briefly go over the next steps, and then we'll see if we have time to take a couple of questions. Well, first, we're not done. There is commitment to continue to build on what we found in the surveys. So we're committed to dialogue, listening to your ideas and solutions, those from the survey as well as others. And there'll be another opportunity for you to continue to give us information and the commitment, as Dr. Watts said, to take action. So what we want to ask you to do is on the engagement website that was created, and that it's listed there on the screen, we want you to give us additional feedback. 2 key areas, as you heard Rich point out, around communication and collaboration. If you have ideas or thoughts on how UAB as an institution can address those areas, go on that website and tell us specifically what you think. Way that you can address communication is by doing this. You can improve the collaboration across the enterprise if you do this. tell us that. We want to hear that. We'll take that into consideration as we continue our next steps. We will, again, continue communication. I think Rich mentioned we're planning another open forum like this one in September. We recognize many of our 9-month faculty are not here now, but we wanted to go ahead and have this meeting, even if it meant having another one in September, so that we could begin our process. But when they're back, we will do that. And there'll be continued dialogue. And again, on behalf of President Watts and Provost Benoit, all of the senior leadership at UAB, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to participate in the survey, give us your honest feedback, and for all of the things that you've done, taking the time to come here today, all the things you do for UAB to make it the great institution that it is. So I think we have a few minutes for a few questions. Ann Buckley has the other microphone.
Testing. Can y'all hear me? Yes. You got cards when you came in. If you have any questions, could you put them on the cards and just pass them down this way? You had something else you wanted to say?
Yeah. So while we're giving folks a chance to think about that, I will share with you just a very quick anecdote. When I did my initial findings presentation, I was meeting with Dr. Watts and a couple other folks in his office, and we were sharing with him some of what I thought we might see based on some of the results from the focus groups. And I was sharing with him, I was a little surprised, pleasantly so. That's good to be pleasantly surprised when the results are more positive. And I was sharing with him the sense of optimism and that how I really was surprised by that. And you know, in my job, in many regards, I think of myself as kind of the voice of the survey results themselves. So I kind of come from an objective perspective and provide whatever context and expertise we can. And you know, I'm also, you know, to the extent I'm able to, I'm pulling for you all, right? And as I was sharing this with Dr. Watts, I said, you know, I'm always hesitant to make corporate metaphors or corporate comparisons when I'm working with higher ed. But if UAB were a stock today, I'm buying this stock, right? I think you all got a lot of good things going on. And I'm excited for you all. I'm excited for what you're doing in this community, what you're doing with your patients, what you're doing with your students. I think you're on a good trajectory. So I know there have been challenges in the past. It's not always smooth, but I think you're doing good work, and we'll applaud that good work now and wish you all the best in your continued good work, recognizing it's not necessarily easy or smooth all the time.
And what did I say?
You said, and this is almost verbatim. You said, yeah, I've already, what would you say verbatim, Dr. Watts?
I said, I doubled down.
Yeah, I doubled down. He doubled down, and I think he has. So, questions?
All right. Any questions to pass in? Well,
I was kind of surprised by when you looked at. Can everyone hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, but I teach. I know how to project. But I was interested when you looked at that number of faculty who sort of responded, and it seemed to be very small. It was 38%. So that means basically that 2/3 of the faculty chose not to engage in this survey. What does that tell you in your experience with other institutions?
All right, so the question was regarding the 38% faculty response rate. And is that low? Is it uncharacteristically low? And what are the implications in terms of the integrity of the faculty response data set? So a couple thoughts on that. Generally, we do see lower response rates among faculty than staff, if I kind of do a meta-analysis of all the surveys that we've done. So to see faculty response lower than staff, that in of itself doesn't concern me. A 38% response rate, given the fact that you all have not done a survey like this, is actually a pretty good place to start. And if we were to look at the confidence intervals and levels and the margin of error on that subset alone, at the 95% confidence level, we still have a margin of error of less than 3% in terms of the faculty responses. This is a good question, and it's also related to a question that we regularly get regarding survey bias, right? So inevitably, at every institution, and I'm sure you all aren't alone, there's a small subset of cynical faculty and staff, right? Just a small subset. And one of the questions that sometimes surfaces is, hey, on surveys like this, isn't it just the happy people respond? Or isn't it just the negative people respond? So it's a very particular type of survey bias. And there's been 3 studies that I've looked at over the last 5 years trying to get a greater sense of survey bias on engagement surveys. And all 3 of them have essentially been have not found any consistent bias that way, one or the other. We do see that bias in other types of surveying, particularly in polling, but we don't necessarily see that bias in these types of surveys. So it's a good data set. Now, would I want a 60% response rate of faculty next time? Absolutely. And I'll even play devil's advocate here. Even if you don't think that the response rate is as high as you would want it, and it does undermine the credibility of the results, in my experience with looking at this kind of data sets, where there's smoke, there's typically fire, right? So even if it's not as solid as we want, I think it's good to be curious about what it potentially means.
It's important to note we have over 2,000 faculty, 1,200 of whom are clinician investigators or teachers. They just had their regular survey, what, a month before?
It started a couple days before,
Around the same time, a couple weeks before. So what we need to do is drill down and see how many faculty in the different schools. And I would predict that the School of Medicine is probably low. We went ahead and did that because we are a complex university with an academic health center, just to start with a baseline, even though it might not be the very biggest and best sample. But we'll drill down to that and find out and look at the proportions from the different schools. And I think that'll be informative.
One of the questions here is, will the slides be posted? And my sense is yes, but not till after the next forum, so that the next group who listens will be able to have the context also. Very soon.
And I think we're going to make this is being simulcast and recorded, right? So I think this we can make available.
Yeah.
You know, the problem, if you will, of just posting a slide deck without the accompanying narrative is that sometimes you lose the context and the nuance, right? You can read one item in particular and may take away something from that doesn't necessarily resonate when you look at the entirety of its data set. The other piece, just speaking to the survey cycle, and Dr. Watts alluded to the fact that we've had another survey going on for a certain portion of the institution. One of the conversations that I've had with the steering committee and Susan and her team is around not just your survey cycle, right? When do we do this survey the next time? But also, what is the survey strategy overall? So one of the things that I would characterize we're seeing as a growing best practices, particularly at large public universities where there's lots of initiatives and efforts going on that necessarily aren't always synchronized, is a survey strategy where we literally get an inventory of what are the different surveys we participate in, why we participate in them, and how they're related. That minimizes survey fatigue and also helps have a kind of a more cohesive assessment process when we're looking at issues related to culture engagement.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. It says a lot that people took time out to come and be a part of the forum, so thank you very much.